The move to the new neighborhood had been a reason for celebration for Laura's family. Her parents, Marcos and Elena, were looking for a quiet place where they could raise their daughter away from the noise and danger of the big city. The street was lined with trees, with well-kept houses and neighbors who seemed to have known each other for years. It was the perfect setting, or so it seemed. On the second day after the move, they met Daniel. He showed up smiling, carrying a homemade pie in his hands. He was just over 40, with fair skin, slightly graying hair, and a friendly demeanor. "Welcome," he said, handing the pie to Elena. "It's tradition here to greet new neighbors with something sweet." Marcos shook his hand, surprised by the warm reception. Daniel lived alone in the house next door. He mentioned that he worked from home as a programmer and was almost always around to help with whatever was needed. In the following days, he began showing up often. Always smiling, he would offer to lend them tools, give tips on house maintenance, and tell funny stories about the neighborhood. Laura, curious as ever, loved to listen. He had a special patience when talking to children, doing funny voices, showing magic tricks, and seeming genuinely interested in hearing about her day. "He's a rare kind of neighbor these days," Elena said one night while doing the dishes. "Kind, polite, it's like he fell from the sky." Marcos agreed. After all, it was comforting to know there was someone trustworthy next door. The bond with Laura grew gradually. It started with Daniel giving her colorful candies when he saw her at the gate. Then he began inviting her to see his dog, a mutt named Max. The animal was gentle and became another reason for Laura to visit, as she loved playing with him in the yard. One day, Daniel showed up with a small, illustrated notebook. "I brought this for you, Laura. You can use it to draw or write your stories." Her eyes lit up. Elena, watching the scene, smiled and thanked him. She never suspected there was anything behind such generosity. As weeks passed, Daniel became Uncle Danny. It was common to see him helping push Laura's swing in the backyard or teaching her how to make origami. Other kids on the street liked him too, but it was with Laura with whom he spent the most time. Always attentive, always ready to compliment her or give a small gift. The whole neighborhood seemed to like him. Older ladies commented on how polite he was, and the other parents appreciated the attention he gave to all the kids. The perfect profile of a good neighbor. But for those who looked closely, there were subtle moments, almost imperceptible. Sometimes when Laura was distracted, his gaze lingered longer than it should. Small pauses, as if he was measuring every gesture, every word. And while Daniel was friendly with everyone, the intensity with which he gravitated toward Laura stood out, but no one noticed. One Saturday morning, Marcos found Daniel and Laura sitting on the sidewalk, laughing at something he was saying. When Marcos approached, Daniel gave him a quick, almost hurried smile and changed the subject. "We were talking about cartoons," he said, standing up. "Laura's got good taste." Marcos chuckled, unsuspecting. That night, while the family had dinner, Laura mentioned that Daniel had promised to show her a surprise in his backyard next weekend. Elena saw nothing wrong with it. She thought it might be a new toy for the dog or a board game. They trusted him so much that sometimes they let Laura play in the yard knowing Daniel was nearby. After all, he was almost family. But in Daniel's mind, something else was growing. A meticulous strategy was being built step by step. Earning the trust not only of the girl but also of her parents was essential. He knew how to act, when to step back to avoid suspicion, and most importantly, how to seem harmless. But what no one imagined was that behind the generosity and constant friendliness, there was a plan in motion. And what began as a simple, neighborly friendship would soon turn into the perfect trap. That night, while the neighbor's house went dark as they fell asleep, Daniel stayed awake, staring out the window at the family's backyard. A faint smile formed on his face. The game had begun.
Filtered through the clouds. It was the day of the surprise Daniel had promised Laura. Helena woke up early to prepare breakfast while Marcos was taking care of a few things in the backyard. Laura was excited. She put on her favorite dress and before even finishing breakfast, ran to the window to see if Daniel was already outside next door. A little after 10, the sound of the neighbor's gate opening echoed. Daniel appeared with his dog, Max, wagging his tail. He waved to Laura. "Ready to see the surprise?" he said, smiling. "Can I, Mom?" the girl asked, her eyes already sparkling. "You can, but just for a little while," Helena replied distractedly as she put the dishes away. Laura went through the side gate that connected the 2 yards. It was the last time Helena saw her at that moment. Time passed quickly. Helena, busy with house chores, didn't notice that more than an hour had gone by. Marcos in the backyard assumed Laura was still with the neighbor. Until, at noon, Helena decided to call her for lunch. "Laura!" she called from the kitchen door. No answer. She tried again, louder. Silence. Worried, Helena went to the side gate. She called, knocked, but didn't even hear Max barking. She found it strange. She walked to the front of the house and rang Daniel's doorbell. No one answered. She went back inside and told Marcos, "Have you seen Laura?" "I thought she was with you," he replied, already feeling a knot in his stomach. The search began on the street. Marcos walked to the corner calling his daughter's name. Helena asked nearby neighbors, but no one had seen her since she'd been with Daniel. 15 minutes passed and unease turned into panic. Marcos ran back and grabbed his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though his hands trembled. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars arrived. The officers listened to the parents, gathered information, and began an immediate search. The protocol was clear. Every minute was vital in a child disappearance case. Daniel appeared shortly after, walking down the sidewalk with a shopping bag in his hands. He seemed surprised by the commotion. "What happened?" he asked, looking around. "Laura's missing," Marcos replied, distressed. "Weren't you with her earlier?" "Yes, she came to see the surprise, but she went back home soon after. I thought she was here," Daniel answered, looking concerned. The officers questioned him, but he responded calmly, giving details about the last time he saw the girl. He said he had gone to the store and showed the receipt as proof. The parents, still trusting in the neighbor's good nature, thanked him for helping. The search intensified. Helicopters flew overhead and tracking dogs combed nearby empty lots. With every hour that passed without news, the anguish grew. Helena cried endlessly, while Marcos tried to keep his head up, though inside he felt a deepening fear. Late that afternoon, Daniel knocked on their door, bringing Helena a bottle of water. "I know it's not much, but I want you to know you can count on me for anything you need," he said softly. Helena thanked him, taking the gesture as yet another sign of his kindness. But something started to bother Marcos. Nothing concrete, just small details. Daniel, so talkative in the first minutes, now spoke less, avoided eye contact. And there was a subtle tension in his movements, as if he were trying to control something. That night, the police returned to report there were no new leads. Helena almost fainted upon hearing it. Marcos stayed quiet, but his mind was racing. He began recalling little things, how Daniel seemed more interested in Laura than in any other child on the street, how he always knew where she was, how he'd insisted on that so-called surprise. Before going to bed, Marcos looked out the window and saw a light on in the neighbor's house. It was late, and Daniel usually went to bed early. His silhouette moved back and forth, like someone restless. The knot in Marcos's chest tightened. There was no proof, only an instinct, that same instinct every father feels when something isn't right. And at that moment, he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he found out the truth. What he didn't know was that he was about to enter a race against time, and any delay could mean not only losing his daughter, but the end of any hope of ever seeing her alive again.
of the street only deepened the feeling of emptiness. Marcos couldn't sleep. He kept tossing and turning in bed, hearing the distant sound of patrol cars still circling the area. Beside him, Elena's breathing was uneven, her body exhausted from crying. The image of the light on in Daniel's house stayed in Marcos's mind like an open wound. He tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be paranoia. After all, the neighbor had helped with the search, had even shown a store receipt. But something didn't add up. A little after midnight, Marcos got up and went to the bedroom window. The light in Daniel's garage was still on. That wasn't normal. Daniel usually kept the house dark, except for the living room light when he was watching TV. Marcos rested his hands on the windowsill and watched. At one point, he saw Daniel come out through the interior door, look around carefully, then disappear back inside. The next day, Marcos decided to act. He spent the morning discreetly watching the neighbor while pretending to tend the garden. He noticed that Daniel avoided eye contact. In the past, he would have come over to talk about the search, offer help, something. But now he kept his distance. In the afternoon, Marcos went to the police station to speak with the investigator in charge of the case. "I know I don't have proof," he said, staring intently at the officer. "But my gut tells me Daniel could be involved." The investigator took notes, but his response was cool. "We need something concrete. We can't act on suspicion alone." Marcos left feeling a mix of frustration and determination. If the police needed something concrete, he would find it himself. That night, he waited until Helena was asleep. Then, quietly, he grabbed a flashlight and went out to the backyard. He leaned against the fence separating the two houses and listened. At first, silence. Then, a muffled sound, like chains dragging or wood being moved. His heart began to pound faster. The garage window was partially open. Marcos stepped closer and looked inside. In the corner, he saw a metal staircase leading to a closed door, probably the entrance to the basement. The light was coming from down there. That's when he heard something that froze his blood, a faint, stifled sob, weak but unmistakable. Marcos backed away, his whole body trembling. He pulled out his phone and called the police. "It's about my daughter's disappearance. I think I know where she is, at my neighbor Daniel's house. Come quickly." While waiting, he kept watching. The interior door opened, and Daniel appeared carrying something he couldn't quite make out, but it looked like a blanket rolled up. He moved quickly, like someone who knew they were doing something wrong. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens began to draw closer. Marcos felt a momentary relief, but he also knew every second mattered. If Daniel realized he was being surrounded, he might do something desperate. Without thinking twice, Marcos pushed open the side gate and entered the neighbor's yard. The garage door was unlocked. He eased it open slowly, trying not to make noise. The smell hit him, a mix of damp mold and something metallic. The muffled sound came again, now clearer. He followed it to the stairs and went down. The cold concrete walls reflected the weak light of a single hanging bulb. And there, at the far end, he saw a half-open door. When he pushed it open, his heart nearly stopped. It was Laura, sitting on the floor, her hands tied, eyes wide with fear. She began to cry when she saw her father. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice trembling. Marcos ran to her, but before he could untie her, he heard quick footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Daniel coming down the stairs, his face twisted with something between rage and desperation. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, charging forward. Marcos stepped in front of his daughter, ready to fight. The sirens were very close now, mixed with the sound of car doors slamming. Daniel hesitated, maybe realizing he had no time. At that moment, police officers stormed into the garage, weapons drawn. "Drop everything and step back," one of them ordered. Daniel slowly raised his hands, but the look he gave Marcos was cold and calculating, as if to say, "This isn't over." Laura was quickly taken out and brought to an ambulance. Marcos followed, still in shock. Relief began to take the place of fear, but he knew the scars of that night would never fade.
Stop, reflecting off the windows of neighboring houses. The entire street was awake. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, trying to understand what was happening, whispering among themselves. Marcos walked quickly beside the paramedics as they took Laura to the ambulance. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from fear. He held his daughter's hand tightly, as if afraid she might disappear again at any second. "She's going to be fine," one of the paramedics said, trying to sound reassuring. "There are no serious injuries, but we're taking her to the hospital for tests and observation." Helena came running, her eyes red from so much crying. When she saw Laura, she dropped to her knees and hugged her, sobbing. "Oh God, my love," she repeated between kisses and tears. Meanwhile, Daniel was being handcuffed by the police. The face that had once been friendly and smiling now looked like a cold mask, almost expressionless. Some neighbors watched in shock. It was hard to connect that man with the Uncle Danny everyone thought they knew. "You are under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and suspicion of child abuse," the officer said, pushing him into the patrol car. Daniel didn't answer. He just kept that fixed, unsettling stare, as if he were taking in every detail and committing it to memory. A moment later, the lead investigator approached Marcos. "I want you to know that your intuition saved your daughter," he said seriously. "We found evidence in the basement. In addition to Laura, there was a small hidden camera and objects from other cases." Marcos felt a chill run through him. "Other cases?" "Yes," the investigator sighed. "Daniel had already been investigated in 2 other cities for child disappearances, but he always managed to slip away for lack of evidence. He would move, gain the neighbors' trust, and start over." The weight of the revelation hit Marcos like a punch. He realized that if he had ignored his instincts, Laura would likely have become just another name on a list of missing children. At the hospital, tests confirmed that although traumatized, Laura was physically unharmed. The doctor recommended immediate psychological care, explaining that the emotional impact could manifest in many ways: nightmares, fear of strangers, anxiety. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, trying to get statements from the family. Helena avoided speaking. Marcos, however, gave a single interview staring straight into the camera. "Be careful who you let into your children's lives. Evil doesn't always have a scary face. It can smile, help, befriend you, and still be waiting for the right moment to strike." With Daniel's arrest, the neighborhood was in shock. People who swore they'd known him for years began to recall small, odd behaviors that at the time didn't seem important. It was as if everyone had awakened from a collective trance. Laura slowly began to return to her routine. Her room was rearranged to make it feel safer, and Marcos installed extra locks and security cameras in the house. At night, he would sit at the edge of her bed until she fell asleep. One night, as he turned off her bedroom light, Laura whispered, "Daddy, is he going to come back?" Marcos swallowed hard and replied, "No, my love, I won't let him." But deep down, he knew her fear was also his. Not the fear that Daniel would escape, the prison sentence was solid, the evidence undeniable, but the deeper fear that somewhere else another perfect neighbor might be preparing to repeat the same story. In the months that followed, Daniel's trial drew national attention.
Victims from other states came forward, and the case exposed serious flaws in communication between police departments. The sentence was severe: life in prison with no possibility of parole. Still, for Marcos and Helena, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the simple fact that they could hold their daughter every day. They knew the emotional scars would remain, but they also knew that courage and instinct had made all the difference. In the final scene of that story, Laura played in the backyard under her father's watchful eye. The sound of her laughter once again filled the house, and for a moment, everything felt like it had before. But Marcos would never forget that night, and he would never stop looking over his shoulder, alert to any sign of danger. Because he knew better than anyone that monsters can live next door.